Welcome to App Stories, a weekly exploration of the world of apps. Today's show is brought to you by Linode, MyNetDiary, and SaneBox. I'm John Voorhees, and with me, as always, is Federico Viticci. Hey, Federico.
Hello, John. How are you?
I'm doing all right. We're still suffering through the winter here in Chicago, but, listeners probably in warmer climates can just chuckle at that, and I guess we'll move on. But it's the time of year when I start getting very tired of being cold. And hopefully that won't last much longer. I heard you talking, I think on Adapt, that the weather was really nice in Rome. And I remember it was quite nice there when I was there in December compared to back home. So
it's very nice. Yes.
I'm very jealous. But we're still stuck in single digit temperatures.
Oh God, yeah, it's very nice here. But I somehow managed to get sick at the very end of the peak flu season here. And I am, I guess this is another expression, I am a little bit under the weather, as you could say.
Yes, you are.
And I am, and my voice, I hope that my voice can stay for this episode. I've been trying various strategies to preserve my voice this week for all my different podcasts, John, including eating raw ginger, which is surprisingly fine. I really hated ginger years ago. Really, I'm good with it now. Like I can eat like a good chunk of raw ginger, and it's fine.
Well, I like ginger, but I've never thought to just chew on a piece of ginger.
Spicy, I can tell you.
I know. That's why you only use a little bit in recipes usually.
Yeah, but I can tell you though that I don't have a cough, I don't have a fever, and the throat situation is better than in previous years when I was not consuming ginger by the bite, basically.
All right.
So I think it's working, and I do like. I mean, after my experiences with different treatments and all that, I'm all in favor of modern medicine, of course. But also, I do like a natural remedy if I can find one. And I think ginger is pretty amazing as a natural thing. So.
Yeah, I'll have to try that myself sometime.
So that would be my life hack for this episode. Right. Eat raw ginger if you can.
Wow, that's quite a life hack. It sets your mouth on fire, I'm sure.
Yes, it will. Absolutely, it will.
All right. Well, I want to mention a little follow-up because, I was listening to the Stack Trace podcast the other day, which is John Sundell and Guy Rambo. Mm-hmm. And they were talking about some of these key up and down event APIs that have been added in 13.4 in the betas. Right. And you know what? It really got me thinking because I've been writing about Photoshop again on the iPad. And one of the things that drove me crazy when I was putting together that Shortcuts Rewind story is that, on the Mac, it's really easy to shift click a bunch of things. And then you have commands to line them up by the left edge or the center or the right edge, however you want. And Photoshop really doesn't do that on the iPad. And it got me to thinking that that's one of those kind of things that these keyboard events might be able to enable, which it would be great if it did. It also, things like just selecting multiple items in any kind of collection view. When you're in photos, for instance, and everything's in most situations it's modal right now, where you have to enter into kind of the selection mode, and everything has to have a check mark. And then you operate it in some way. I would think you might, things like that could be modified to some degree with these new APIs too.
Yeah, I was thinking about this and all the features that could become possible by virtue of having these key up and down events. And it seems to me like all sorts of shift select and shift move, shift drag could become, more desktop-like on iPad, which is really exciting to think about, like this idea of having better selections, whether it's about multiple paragraphs, for example, or different items in a file manager. That would be really interesting. And also to hold down a key and have your selection mode change. That would also be really interesting. But also things like, for example, holding down a key and then tapping on a link or maybe a bunch of links and they all open in the background. Or, for example, opening new windows by holding down something and then doing something else with your other hand. That could also be really interesting on iPad. So I'm definitely on the lookout for these kinds of changes, and I hope that developers are quick to adopt them when 13.4 launches.
Yeah, I agree. What's interesting about Photoshop in particular is that Adobe has something a little bit like that because they have this little disc that sits on screen and you can tap it with one finger and then it acts as a modifier key to do other things in the UI. And I just kind of wonder whether that's going to be as useful as it was originally once we have these other ways of doing that with a keyboard. I suppose if you're not using a keyboard, it's good to have the modifier disc regardless. But yeah, it's the sort of thing that adds a lot of new dimensions to what you can accomplish. This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Linode. Whether you're working on a personal project or managing your enterprise's infrastructure, Linode has the pricing, support, and scale that you need to take your project to the next level. They have 11 data centers spread throughout the world, including their newest one in Sydney, Australia. And with their enterprise-grade hardware, S3-compatible storage option, and their next-generation network, Linode delivers the performance you expect at a surprisingly good price. That's why we use them here at Mac Stories. Get started on Linode today with a $20 credit for listeners of this show, and you'll get access to native SSD storage, a 40 gigabit network, and industry-leading processors, a revamped cloud manager built on an open-source single-page app, root access to your server along with API version 4, and a Python CLI. Of course, also Nanode plans starting as low as $5, and a whole bunch more. Go to linode.com/appstories and use the promo code AppStories2020 when creating a new Linode account, and you'll get a $20 credit towards your next project. Oh, and you know what? Linode are hiring too. So if you're interested in a job with Linode, check out their website. That's linode.com/careers to find out more. Once again, that URL is linode.com/appstories and the promo code AppStories2020 for that $20 credit. Our thanks to Linode for their support of the show. Federico, I want to switch on over to a new app that you discovered and that Ryan wrote about on the site last week, which is called Noto. You want to mention that to listeners? Because this is a really interesting app that's it's unlike anything we've seen. And, it feels like these days there's very rarely an app, especially like a note-taking app, that comes out that's really unique and innovative. But this app is both of those things.
Yeah, so Noto, I came across this app I think a couple of months ago, maybe last month, and it's kind of a funny story because on Adapt, I was talking with Ryan about how I've always wanted to have a note-taking app that had support for tables, but tables where you could put all kinds of data into each cell, like images or like different text formats, like headings, for example, or lists or links. Again, I just wanted to have the freedom of creating a table that could hold any kind of text format or attachment. And I said on Adapt, well, maybe some listener will get in touch with me and will recommend some existing solution. Nobody got in touch because, again, I believe that nobody knew that this sort of solution existed. And then just a few days after that episode went live, I was browsing the App Store, as I always do. And I believe it was in a section, like one of those sections curated by Apple. Something like, it wasn't new apps we'll love. I think it was in the productivity category, so not on the front page. It was in the productivity category and in some curated collection about note-taking. I saw this icon for this app called Noto. I was like, what is this? And then I opened the App Store preview, and I saw, I believe whether it was in the promo video or in one of the screenshots, a table with some images inside. And I couldn't believe what I was looking at, because I was like, this is exactly what I just mentioned on the show. And nobody told
Right.
me that this app existed, and I had no idea that this app was out there. The developer never got in touch with us. I totally missed the existence of this particular productivity app, which is unusual for me because I like to keep tabs on these kinds of utilities. So anyway, Noto, the best way to think about it is like a supercharged version of Apple Notes. It shares many of the same ideas as Apple Notes, so like clean design, multiple headings, support for multiple windows, and drag and drop, and it works everywhere, including the Mac, thanks to Catalyst. Syncs with iCloud, so it covers all the basics. But then it supercharges the traditional note-taking experience by adding some options that Apple does not support, and also taking some inspiration from tools like Notion, which I am familiar with and I do appreciate at a conceptual level, but I absolutely cannot stand in terms of the native experience on iOS.
Right.
So what sets Noto apart is, first of all, this ability to create tables that contain not just plain text, but formatted text, but also attachments. So you can put images inside tables, you can put videos inside tables, you can put lists, you can put rich links. So a table can be sort of like a mini database, and you can have a table that combines rich text and images together, and it looks fantastic. I've been using this option myself to do some research on apps, on yes, of course, competitive Pokemon play. I've been using
Right.
it for all kinds of things, and it's really nice to be able to have a table with some images. Also, in Noto, one of the things that I love is that when you copy a link from your browser, from Twitter, whatever, and you open Noto and you hit paste, so you either do Command V or you do paste manually, the URL is not pasted as a raw link like HTTP, but as a native rich link in iOS 13. This is super nice. This is the first time that I've seen any app not show you the raw URL by default, which you can do. You can convert a rich link to a raw URL if you want to, but by default, you just see the native rich preview. Like the link becomes this tiny bubble with the preview of the original web page, like the hero image or the video or the thumbnail, whatever it is. And it's super nice to be able to save links from Twitter or Safari this way, because you have a much more visual solution to see these links instead of just a bunch of HTTP URLs. And lastly, what I would mention is this idea that Noto allows you to put different kinds of blocks inside of a note. So you can have a code block, and that can be a code snippet with support for syntax highlighting in different languages. So you can have a CSS or a JavaScript or an HTML code snippet, or you can have a block quote block, which can be like a quote from somebody else. You can have images, you can have drawings, you can have tables, you can have videos. So this idea that like you can mix and match different elements, but they don't interfere with each other. So you don't risk of like you're typing into the code block, but then you have a block quote beneath that, and you don't risk of like mixing them together as it would usually happen in like a word processor, like in Word, that you mix and match the styles accidentally. This does not happen because they are a little bit like Notion. They are like actually separate entities, separate blocks within the body of a note. And it's really well done because you can tap on the code snippet and you're editing your code, and then you can tap on the block quote and you're typing text. But unlike Notion, this is all super native to the platform. So you have support for multiple font sizes, you have support for drag and drop, for dark mode, and you have different styles, and you can have multiple windows. So it's a native experience that adds a bunch of useful options on top of the classic Apple Notes style of note taking, but it also takes inspiration from tools like Notion and this idea of having different blocks of different elements within the body of a note, and it makes it available on all platforms. So iPhone, iPad, and the Mac with iCloud Sync it's really well done. There's some missing features, which is why I hope that having a review on Mac Stories, maybe more people will discover this app and will support the developer, because some of the features are behind a Pro unlock. There's some missing functionalities that I hope the developer will be able to add in 2020. Shortcuts integration is completely missing at the moment. Right. Keyboard shortcuts could be improved on iPad. There's some issues with text selection involving keyboard shortcuts that Ryan also called out in his review. And there's just a few other things that I would like to see improved. Maybe to have more themes, or maybe more icon options. But in any case, I have been transferring some of my notes from Apple Notes into Noto because of the additional styling options and the additional formatting options in the body of a note. It is really well done. It is the first time I can tell. If you can't tell, I will just say this. It is the first time that I am really excited about a new note-taking app. Yeah, it's one of those apps that as soon as I saw it, I was like, somebody made exactly the tool I was looking for.
Yeah, I think the last time we saw an app that really did something completely different from a note-taking standpoint was probably Agenda, and that's been at least a couple of years now since that app came out. And it takes note-taking in a whole different direction that's very calendar-based. But this is a really interesting app. Now, it does not have collaboration or sharing, does it?
It does have collaboration and sharing.
Oh, it does? All
iCloud.
right. So
yes, it does.
Oh, all right. See, I haven't not used it nearly to the extent you have. I just opened it up and played around with it a little bit. That's interesting. I'll have to check that out. That it implements kind of a custom copy and paste too, doesn't it?
Yes, which I'm not completely sold on, and I can see the argument for making a custom menu, but also I wish that the developer embraced, because it does support things like context menus elsewhere in the app. So like if you long press on a link, you do get the context menu with the preview of the web page and the quick actions in the menu. I wish that it was also using the native copy and paste. It's also using a custom text selection engine, which arguably it is better than the iOS 13 one.
But it probably breaks your brain a little bit going from one to the other.
It does. It's better, but it does break your brain a little. So maybe that could be revised. But like overall, like if you want to have formatted notes with like tables and multiple sections and all that kind of stuff, take a look at this app because it's free to download. And again, the pro stuff, like more blocks, like different types of blocks, those are require the pro unlock, but you can totally try it for free. And also nice, there's a subscription to pay month by month or on an annual basis, but also you can purchase a lifetime single purchase, like one-time purchase option. It's $25 for the pro version, and it's just one time. Or you can subscribe. And I like having this kind of freedom. I can choose. That's nice.
Yeah, I like that choice too. And I've been talking to some developers. I think more and more of them are looking at that as an option. It's really just a matter of picking what that lifetime amount is so that it works with whatever their cost structure is, right? And the anticipated amount of time someone might stay as a customer. And I know I've heard people tell me that it's like 2 to 3 years worth of subscription pricing is the right amount. But I think it really also depends on the kind of app as well.
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting to see if more people go down that path. I like it myself.
Yeah. I should mention before we move on, because I need to bring this up, you can also embed documents, mathematical operations, and you can also scan documents. So all kinds of attachments within the app. You can lock your notes with a password or Face ID. And you have a bunch of export options. If you want to get your data out of Noto, you can export in HTML, in Markdown, which is very nice, in PDF, or even in JPEG. So plenty of export options. Yeah, I'm very, very impressed. And I hope the developer can keep working on this.
This episode of App Stories is brought to you by MyNet Diary. MyNet Diary is a modern diet app with a strong focus on design, quality, and usability. It does everything you'd want in this kind of app, but you've probably never found. What makes MyNet Diary so unique is that it's been developed with a team of registered dietitians. The app also has a huge, reliable database of foods, and it's been designed to make food tracking lightning fast. On top of that, It's built around you, allowing users total control over configuring its dashboard to suit their individual needs. What's more, there's no user tracking or ads either. Plus, there are fun, cool features like My Net Diary's AR grocery check. The app really covers all of the bases, from diet planning and healthy eating to exercising and grocery shopping. There are also easy-to-make recipes created by nutrition experts that are as tasty as they are healthy. Of course, the app includes the latest OS features too. Things like an Apple Watch app with fantastic complications and custom UI for its iPad users. Best of all, My Net Diary includes more for free than any other diet app, which I suspect is one reason they have a whopping 9 million users. Try the next generation of diet app and lose weight and get healthy for life with My Net Diary by visiting mynetdiary.com. Again, that URL is mynetdiary.com. We'll have a link in the show notes too. Our thanks to My Net Diary for supporting App Stories. All right, Federico, let's move on to the main topic for today. And I thought it would be fun today to talk about apps and services and how they've been integrated by Apple in particular. Because I feel like if you turn back the clock and you look to the beginning of the iPhone and the iPad even, there wasn't a lot of service integration. I mean, Apple's services is kind of a more recent story, and we've talked about a lot about that. And I know you have too on Connected and in other places. But there is an app angle to this that I find very interesting that Apple's only really just kind of scratched the surface on. And that is integrating services in the apps themselves, treating apps as services in a way more than in the past, and that sort of thing. Because I think there's opportunities here. There are also things that I think are potential difficulties for Apple, frankly. What do you think?
I think what's interesting is there's a couple of themes that I would like to discuss with you. The first one is this idea of Apple starting to blend the native app world with the services world. And I think a good example of this is the idea of continuous feature rollouts. So take a look at Apple Music, the service, and the Music app as an example. So
right.
Apple Music launched in 2015, and the Music app was very different back then. They did a major redesign of the Music app in iOS 10, and more or less, the overall style and design and aesthetic of the Music app has mostly stayed the same since. There have been a few feature tweaks, like the Now Playing screen has been tweaked, and the App Next queue has been completely redone, and we now have real-time lyrics, but the overall structure, arguably, is the same.
Yeah, it is. There are a few things moved around too, I suppose. Yeah. Like a lot of the share and action type of items have been moved around.
Right, new menus and all that kind of stuff, but like they have not like completely, ripped apart the entire application and redone it from scratch.
Right.
However, on the content side, it looks really different from even a couple of years ago. And that is largely because of the new initiatives that Apple has rolled out through the course of a couple of years, but even during the year, not necessarily at WWDC, but like in February or like in November, outside of the typical Apple software release cycle. And that was possible because Apple, the Music app on your phone and your iPad, the native client, is a client for a service. And Apple can roll out these feature changes server side without you having to update your software to a new version. And so I created a collection of a bunch of examples going back in time. For instance, they revamped with a lot more content and a lot new sections the Browse tab, so the main section of the Music app. Last year in March 2019, they almost completely redesigned it with new sections and new categories. This is when they introduced the like "We're Loving" section, the "Coming Soon" section,
Right.
more highlights for Beats One content. And again, this basically went live overnight and it just propagated to people's devices. A few months ago, last year, they launched New Music Daily and the New Music Daily playlist. So this was a combination of a new playlist that is updated on a daily basis and a new section of Beats of Apple Music and Beats One, where Zane Lowe has a new show and there's a new page that shows you like highlights from the interviews that he does, and there's like a curated collection of the songs and albums that have been talked about on the show. And again, this is like a new content initiative that lives within Apple Music, and it can be rolled out to the Music app without having to actually change the native experience. Apple Music Replay, of course, was another example. They launched this service on the Replay website, and you do something on the website, and it shows up in the native app. And in this case, it's a playlist, but the point is basically the same. Something happens server side, and then it also shows up in the native client. And just this week, just a few days ago, this is perhaps the perfect example. And actually, like a missing feature of the streaming service was rolled out as a server-side change. I'm talking about the ability to see alternate album versions. So multiple versions of the same album. For example, if an album has clean and explicit versions, or a demo version, or a remaster, or a deluxe version, all those versions are now grouped together into the same section, and that section lives at the bottom of an album's page. And you would think, well, this is an actually new section that's like sandwiched in between two other sections. This must be a native feature change to the Music app, but no, it was just rolled out overnight to everybody's devices because it's a server side type of change. So these two, I don't know what you think, John, but this to me feels like it is a perfect example of the kind of balance that I think we'll see more and more going forward, in terms of this idea that the modern Apple as a also services company needs to balance these new content initiatives, these new service-based changes with the native experience on your device. And so the Music app, sure, it has new menus, new context menus, some keyboard shortcuts on iPad. All those are actual like native functionalities that require an OS update. But all these other like content-based features, they are part of a service, and as a service, they don't require, a new version of iOS or a point update to iOS. And I think this is a new word for us, because we used to cover new features in Apple built-in apps at WWDC or whenever a new software update came out. But now we can always cover them throughout the year because the product is always changing.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. And I think the only apps where that happened in the past were things like Clips, which is a separate download on the App Store where Apple is making it. And Apple doesn't have much of a history with sticking with those apps to begin with anyway. One thing I want to raise with you, Federico, I think this is a really good example of blending software and services. But and I think a lot of that is driven by the software itself, because there's a place for all these things to kind of hook in and to be updated without actually changing the underlying app itself. One area where I don't think that's necessarily quite as true with music is with the editorial content, because interviews and kind of song by song narratives about new albums, which you see are all kind of crammed into a sidebar, a little corner of the Music app, where they're not very obvious and they're a little hard to get to. And I think it's an interesting contrast between that, where I don't think that they're surfaced as prominently as they should be, and the App Store, where with the Today tab, editorial content is front and center and one of the most important parts of the App Store now. And it's interesting to me because the App Store has a place for that, where it's very prominent and right up there front and center. But I don't know about you, but I have noticed that there's more recycling of content going on there than there has been in the early days of the App Store. And I get that. I mean, you and I write on the web, and it takes a lot of time to create that content, and there is a good reason to recycle some of it. But I think that it's a new thing for Apple to have to keep fresh content that's generated internally inside an app, because that historically has not been something they've done. And in music, it's a little easier because most of the content that's being showcased there is from third parties. I mean, yes, Beats, we've got Beats, which is part of Apple, and you've got these editorial blurbs about albums and things. But for the most part, we're talking about recording artists and their music and interviews and things like that. And then on the App Store, you've actually got stories that are being written about third-party apps. And I think there's an interesting tension there, trying to keep up the pace with the apps, keep up with the pace of the App Store, and also making that stuff visible, but also fresh at the same time in both apps like the App Store and music.
Yeah, and that's almost the other side of the coin when it becomes a problem, that you can update your native app with this fresh content because it's a server-side change, but then that content only lives within that specific section of the app, and it cannot be searched, and it cannot be linked. And I wish that more things that Apple does, from this editorial curation standpoint, could be linked, could be referenced. And they're doing a good enough job. For example, if you look at the App Store and you look at stories from the App Store, and each story can be linked. And we've talked about before about how we don't like the fact that no story on the App Store has a byline. You have no clue as to who actually wrote a story. And even if we do know a few people who work on those stories, and we can tell because we know who actually is writing this, I think we talked about this before. I think it would be better if they had a bit more personality. But still, the main point being, those stories can be linked, can be searched on the web, I believe, can be open in a web browser, which is good. The same should be true for content, because those are actual interviews that Apple is stuffing inside of the description field of an album. And they're fun fact, that text actually shows up in the Apple Music API. You can retrieve that text, that interview, that description of an album, yes, via the API. Toolbox Pro, for example, has, I believe, access to this data, but I've seen it myself when working with the Apple Music API. So they have the means of categorizing this content, and maybe it should be exposed in a better way. I also wanted to mention something interesting that Apple is also doing. They rolled out this feature last year 2 years ago, actually, with iOS 12. And I'm talking about the integration between Stocks and Apple News. Now, don't make fun of me because these are some of the least used Apple apps. But there's a single idea that I would like Apple to explore more. And that is, in Stocks, you can now since iOS 12, you can read business news powered by Apple News. So there's an Apple News section inside the Stocks app, sort of like an embedded content coming from Apple News, lives inside Stocks. Now, I think this is an interesting idea because it could be modified to work with a bunch of other Apple properties. Of course, music comes to mind. It would be interesting to see, for example, integration with music reviews and interviews from other music publications like Rolling Stone or Pitchfork or Stereogum. There's plenty of websites that show up in Apple News and could provide some kind of backend for browsing more music content within Apple Music itself. It could be an interesting idea. Or maybe Apple Arcade and video game news. There's a bunch of mobile gaming oriented websites that could provide some content, but really, I guess the integration that makes the most sense, if we were to blend two different Apple services together, then I guess that would be Apple TV Plus and podcasts. There's multiple reports floating around talking about the fact that Apple is preparing, in addition to a new podcast originals service, a series of Apple TV Plus focused programming in the form of podcasts. So new podcasts about Apple TV shows. This is not a new idea. The folks in the Hollywood industry have caught on to this trend a while back. For example, I would recommend go listen to the Chernobyl podcast. So the folks at HBO did a podcast for the really excellent Chernobyl show last year. Also, The Good Place podcast is very good. The Good Place, the TV show, wrapped up just a few weeks ago, and the NBC also had a podcast about the show where you could get to know the characters and the people who make the show, and go behind the scenes in audio form with a podcast. So this idea of taking a peek behind the curtain and getting to hear directly from the people who act in one of your favorite shows or work on one of your favorite shows, I think it's a good idea, and it makes total sense to have maybe in a few months in the TV app, you will have some kind of tiny section that shows you a preview of a podcast that you can only get on Apple Podcasts about go behind the scenes of, I don't know, For All Mankind season 2, for example, and maybe you could listen to that episode directly from the TV app, or maybe it could be just a preview and you catch a glimpse of like 30 seconds and then you continue in podcasts. But I think we will continue to see more of this, like this integration between different Apple properties, between different Apple services. In fact, I am more inclined to believe that they will do more of this like in-house integration. So two Apple properties together rather than going the third-party content route. So aggregating content from different websites with Apple News. I think it's more likely that Apple will prefer doing this with content that they fully control.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I think there are other opportunities here with TV, things like books as well, because,
totally. Yes.
Oprah Winfrey has a book club show on TV Plus, and I was just looking through it, and maybe there's a website or something where they link to these books. But if I open up one of these episodes and scroll through the page, there are no links there to the Apple bookstore, and I would think that that's a natural place to have that. I mean, I would think this stuff should be... it's almost like we're kind of growing used to this interface with a lot of apps now that are based on tiles, and I feel like some of this content should be designed for tiles so that they can just be dropped in wherever it makes sense to have some kind of cross promotion, whether it's a podcast or a book or anything like that. I mean, it would make a lot of sense and help, I think, bring new people to the different products too.
Yeah, I agree, and I fully expect that books is a great example. We will continue to see this sort of like cross-pollination between different Apple apps and services for sure.
This episode of App Stories is brought to you by SaneBox. Everyone has something that they don't like about email. I know that is absolutely true for me. And that's exactly why you should be trying SaneBox. While it would be wonderful if you could just go in there and delete every single email in your inbox, that's just not practical. There's important stuff in there and things you have to deal with. But the problem is that all email looks exactly the same, and it's hard to decipher which messages need your attention. Well, here's the thing. Wouldn't it be nice if you had some sort of solution that would pre-sort all of your email even before it hits your inbox? That's exactly what SaneBox does. SaneBox sorts through your email and moves all of the trivial stuff to different folders so that only the messages in your inbox are the ones that you need to see. And the great thing is that it will work seamlessly with your current system because it works with any app. It all happens server side. One of the best features of SaneBox is called the black hole. All you have to do is move an unwanted email message into the black hole folder, and you'll never hear from that person ever again. It's kind of wonderful. With SaneBox, you can also set up email reminders, snooze your email, and do a whole bunch of other things. I have been using SaneBox for years, really ever since I started working with Federico at Mac Stories in 2015, and it's how I keep my email under control. I get lots and lots of email. My email address is published on the web. It just keeps coming and coming and coming, but SaneBox gets it all organized for me so that I know the things in my inbox are things I have to deal with, and there's other things in other folders that I can look at another time. To help you get a little more organized in your inbox, we've worked out a special deal with SaneBox just for listeners of this show. Just go to sanebox.com/appstories today, and you'll get a 2-week free trial and an extra $25 credit just because you're listening to this episode. You don't have to enter your credit card information unless you decide to buy, so there's really nothing to lose. Check it out today to get your email finally under control. Again, that URL is SaneBox, SANEBOX.com/appstories to get a 2-week free trial plus a $25 credit. Our thanks to SaneBox for their support of App Stories. You know, the last thing that we should talk about, Federico, is Apple Pay, because that has spread to a lot of different places, right? I mean, you see it in Safari, it's part of Wallet, and it's in Messages. I just today sent a couple of dollars to my son so he could buy something out of a vending machine at school.
I cannot use that feature myself.
No,
I'm very
I thought,
sad.
Did it not come to Italy yet? I thought it did.
No, we don't have Apple Pay Cash.
Oh, all right. Well, it is nice once you get it. I think for some bizarre reason, the person I've sent the most cash to and received the most cash from is Stephen Hackett. But that's a long story.
Why? Oh my God.
We both split 2 different hotel rooms at 2 different times. That's what we were paying each other back for hotel rooms.
You're not buying Steven sandwiches then. That's just your son.
Yeah,
okay.
just my son. And yeah, I could see Apple Pay showing up in other places. You know, I know we've talked about it a little bit, and I know you have in a lot of places. Things like merchandise and concert tickets and music would be really cool. I do wonder though whether Apple really wants to get into the physical goods business, because then they have to deal with all sorts of things that Amazon has to deal with, like sales tax and shipping. And I mean, sure, they could partner with somebody for some of that stuff. And there are obviously solutions that other online retailers use to deal with all the tax regulations around the world. But it is a whole another layer of complication that they don't have to deal with right now with digital goods.
Yeah, I agree. I believe if this integration between apps and services continues, they will very much prefer to roll out these integrations for content that they fully control and own, so they do not depend on third-party vendors or data providers. So books, podcasts, TV, and music, I can definitely see Apple doing more things, for sure.
Yep, absolutely. All right, well, it's going to be interesting to see what we see this year, because I feel like we're at the point where each of these services has been around long enough and is mature enough, and the apps have been, for the most part, updated to the extent where we'll probably start seeing more of this, hopefully with iOS 14 and the new version of macOS as well. All right, Federico. Well, I think that's good for today. We will, of course, see everybody next week. I want to thank our 3 sponsors again. That's Linode, MyNet Diary, and SaneBox. And of course, you can find me and Federico over at macstories.net and Club Mac Stories. Federico's online on Twitter as Viticci, that's VITICCI. He's also that on Instagram. And I'm at John Voorhees on both. JOHN VOORHWS. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.